For centuries, Britain was one of the world's richest nations, the empire that industrialised much of the planet, the financial hub of Europe, the home of London, one of the wealthiest cities on earth. And yet today, the story looks very different. By 2030, the average UK family will be £1,400 poorer, which is around $1,750 than they are now. The poorest third will lose 6% of their disposable income, even as rents, energy bills and food prices keep climbing. How did the fifth largest economy in the world fall into this trap? Why are British living standards collapsing while other nations, America, Germany, even Poland, continue to grow? This isn't just a cost of living crisis, it's a deeper structural decline. And if nothing changes, Britain may soon find itself sliding into irrelevance in the global economy. Today, we're going to uncover how one of the richest countries in history became poorer every single year and what that means for its future. Let's start with one shocking fact. The United Kingdom is the only G7 country that is still poorer than it was before the 2008 financial crisis. Japan recovered. The United States surged ahead. Even Italy, often portrayed as Europe's sick man, has recovered better than Britain. Yet here we are 17 years later with an economy that has never regained the ground it lost. Behind that headline number is a painful reality. Stagnant GDP per capita for nearly 2 decades. That means for the average person, the economic pie hasn't really grown since 2008. While the population increased, the share of prosperity available per person has flatlined. Compare that to the US, where GDP per capita is up significantly since the crisis, and the contrast is stark. Britain is stuck in neutral, while others are racing forward. This stagnation is felt acutely in wages. Real wages in 2025 are still below their pre-crisis peak. In simple terms, after adjusting for inflation, the average British worker earns less today than they did nearly 20 years ago. Imagine working for 2 decades and seeing no real improvement in your paycheck, only higher prices for housing, food and energy. For many, that's daily life. Why does this wage stagnation persist? The major reason is productivity, the value each worker produces per hour. In Britain, productivity has flatlined since 2008. Workers here produce less per hour than their counterparts in France or Germany, despite often working longer hours. Economists call this the productivity puzzle. But for ordinary people, it's not a puzzle at all. It's the reason their paychecks feel permanently stuck. Without productivity growth, wage growth simply can't happen. The consequences are visible in living standards. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's 2025 report lays it out starkly. Living standards are falling across all families, with the poorest hit hardest. On average, families are expected to be about £1,400, which is around $1,750, worse off by 2030, while the lowest income households will lose around £900 or $1,125 a year, a 6% drop in disposable income. These numbers translate into skipped meals, unaffordable heating, and the dreams of home ownership pushed further out of reach. And this isn't just about statistics, it's about a broader feeling that the UK is caught in a slow decline. A once dynamic economy is now the laggard of the developed world. While other nations are investing, innovating and pulling ahead, Britain's citizens are left asking, why does it feel like we're always running in place? To understand why Britain is poorer today, we need to step back and look at the critical shocks that shaped its economy over the past 2 decades. Each moment left scars that the nation never fully healed from. As we already mentioned, the first blow came with the 2008 financial crisis. Britain was more exposed than most, thanks to its oversized banking sector. London had become a global hub for finance, but when the bubble burst, the UK was hit harder than almost any other advanced economy. GDP fell by more than 6% in a single year, which was the steepest decline since World War II. Banks had to be bailed out at enormous cost to taxpayers, leaving public finances deeply scarred. What followed in the 2010s were the austerity years. Successive governments argued that deep cuts were necessary to stabilise the debt. Public services were slashed. Local councils saw budgets cut by over 40%, leaving libraries, youth centres and transport networks underfunded. Investments in infrastructure and skills lagged far behind competitors. While Germany was building modern transport corridors and France was investing in high-speed broadband, the UK was cutting back. Economists now widely agree austerity slowed growth, weakened productivity, and hollowed out resilience. Then came Brexit in 2016. The referendum result promised sovereignty, but economically it created new trade barriers with Britain's largest market. Foreign investment collapsed. According to the Office for National Statistics, inward investment fell by more than 30% in the years after Brexit compared to the years before. Small exporters faced red tape, and uncertainty over future trade rules discouraged firms from expanding. Growth slowed compared to G7 peers, and the UK missed out on investment booms enjoyed elsewhere. Finally, the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns of 2020 dealt another devastating shock. The UK economy shrank by nearly 10% in a single year, the sharpest fall among G7 countries. Government debt surged as billions were borrowed to fund furlough schemes and emergency aid. Entrepreneurs adapted, many forced to go digital, but even that had a dark side. Rising taxation and heavy regulation discouraged many from staying in the UK, leading to an exodus of small business owners and wealth creators. Each of these shocks weakened Britain's foundations. Instead of bouncing back stronger, the country stumbled from one crisis to the next. And now in 2025, the numbers tell a clear and uncomfortable truth. The United Kingdom is carrying a heavier burden than at any point in modern peacetime. The first burden is debt. Today, UK government debt stands at roughly 100% of GDP. That means the state owes as much as the entire economy produces in a year. Servicing this debt is crushing. Interest payments alone are nearly $125 billion annually. To put that into perspective, that's more than Britain spends on education. Money that could have gone into schools, infrastructure, or innovation is instead swallowed by creditors. And forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility warn that if growth continues to stagnate, debt interest could climb even higher in the next decade. But how the government responds to this burden is just as important. Chancellor Rachel Reeves has imposed strict fiscal rules, no borrowing for day-to-day spending, and a balanced current budget within 5 years. In practice, that means cutting benefits rather than raising taxes on the wealthy. Already £5 billion in cuts have been announced, with disability benefits among the hardest hit. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation warns these policies will push hundreds of thousands of the poorest households deeper into poverty, while those at the top remain relatively untouched. The short-term effect is a leaner welfare state, but the long-term consequence could be weaker social mobility and higher inequality. Housing too is squeezing families harder than ever. Since the start of 2025, mortgage holders are paying $1,750 more per year, while renters face an extra $375 annually. That's on top of already sky-high costs relative to income. Economists warn that if interest rates remain elevated, younger households will be permanently locked out of home ownership. The housing crisis is no longer just about buying, it's about affordability across the board, with ripple effects on spending, saving, and even fertility rates. The Bank of England suggests that if rates stay above 4% for several years, average mortgage costs could climb another 10 to 15% by 2027, adding even more pressure to households. Another trend is harder to see but equally damaging. Capital flight. Britain has lost more millionaires per capita in the last year than almost any other country, according to Henley & Partners' Wealth Migration Index. Entrepreneurs, investors and professionals are relocating to Dubai, Singapore or Switzerland. The reasons are clear: higher taxes, the abolition of non-domicile status and fears of rising inheritance tax. Every departure means less investment, fewer jobs and weaker innovation. Wealth consultants expect the outflow of high net worth individuals to remain above $4,000 per year through 2030 unless policy changes restore competitiveness. The erosion of competitiveness is also visible in the UK's economic freedom ranking. Back in 2006, Britain was in the global top 10. Today, in 2025, it has slid into the mid-60s. That's a dramatic fall, making the country less attractive for businesses compared to Ireland, the Netherlands, or even Eastern European economies. Lower scores on regulation, tax competitiveness, and labour flexibility send up a clear signal. The UK is no longer one of the easiest places to do business in the developed world. Finally, we come to the size of the state itself. In 2025, government spending accounts for 45% of GDP, the highest peacetime share since World War II. That means nearly half of all economic activity flows through the state. Supporters argue this is necessary to fund healthcare, pensions and defence. Critics point to inefficiency, bloated bureaucracy, poor delivery and diminishing returns. The real issue is sustainability. If the government keeps expanding while productivity stagnates, the tax base will erode and debt will climb even further. For most British families, the economic crisis really affects their daily lives. Rising food prices, higher energy bills, and record housing costs have eaten away at disposable income. A trip to the supermarket that cost £50 5 years ago now easily pushes £70 to £80. Heating a modest home through the winter is hundreds of pounds more expensive than before, and for millions renting or paying off mortgages, housing costs consume an even larger share of take-home pay. This squeeze is magnified by what economists call a stealth tax. Frozen tax thresholds mean that as wages rise nominally, more income is pulled into higher tax brackets, even if people don't feel richer. It's taxation without a vote, quietly raising billions for the Treasury. For the average worker, it means earning a small raise doesn't translate into higher standards of living. It's swallowed by the state. By 2025, this fiscal drag is one of the biggest contributors to stagnant take-home pay. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation put numbers on this reality as well. By 2030, the poorest households are projected to be around $1,125 a year worse off, representing a 6% drop in disposable income. But it's not just the poorest who suffer. The average family will lose around $1,750 by the end of the decade. That's the equivalent of a month's rent in many cities, simply erased. These are warnings that the living standards of an entire country are sliding backwards. This is why the phrase cost of living crisis no longer feels temporary. It has become structural. What began as a shock after Brexit, worsened by COVID, and spiked with the energy crisis is now baked into Britain's economic fabric. For families, that means the crisis doesn't end with the next budget or interest rate cut. It shapes long-term choices, whether to have children, whether to buy a home, whether to stay in Britain at all. When you compare Britain to its peers, the gap becomes striking. Let's start with the United States. While the UK has struggled with flatlining growth since the 2008 crisis, America has been propelled forward by two powerful engines: the strength of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and the tech boom that created companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Tesla. These firms added trillions in market value and pushed wages higher, while US capital markets attracted global money. What that means is America can, to some degree, print its way out of trouble. When the Federal Reserve creates dollars, the world absorbs them because the dollar still dominates global trade and reserves. Nearly 60% of foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars as of 2025. The pound has no such privilege. Britain cannot simply expand the money supply without risking a run on the currency. When the Bank of England prints pounds, markets demand higher interest rates to hold them, pushing up the cost of government borrowing. This is why the US could spend massively during COVID, while the UK's fiscal space was more limited. And it explains why British debt at around 100% of GDP feels far heavier than the American debt at well over that level. The US borrows in the currency the whole world wants. The UK borrows in a currency only it uses. Now let's look at another comparison, this time with resource-rich nations. Think about Norway or Qatar. Both countries struck oil and gas riches in the 20th century. But unlike the UK, they didn't just spend the windfall, they saved it. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, built on North Sea oil revenues, is now worth more than $1.6 trillion in 2025, the largest in the world. That's over $300,000 for every Norwegian citizen. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund is more than $500 billion, providing a cushion that supports citizens and future generations. And Britain? Despite extracting enormous wealth from the North Sea in the 1970s and 80s, it failed to build a national savings pool. Oil revenues were used to fund government spending and tax cuts in the short term, rather than creating a long-term endowment. The result is clear. Britain has no sovereign wealth fund to fall back on today. If the UK had followed Norway's path, estimates suggest it could now have a fund worth hundreds of billions of pounds or trillions of dollars by now. And now ask yourself this: why does a small country like Norway, with only 5.5 million people, hold one of the greatest financial cushions on earth, while Britain, with 67 million people, has none? That's the difference between strategic planning and short-term thinking. This contrast explains why Britain feels uniquely fragile in 2025. The US can rely on the dollar, Norway and Qatar can rely on sovereign wealth funds. Britain, despite once having both global finance and oil riches, failed to convert advantage into resilience, and that failure now defines the nation's place in the global economy. And if nothing changes, Britain's young generation will inherit a future where money buys less, opportunities shrink, and escape becomes the best option. Already surveys show that more than half of Britons under 35 say they don't believe they'll ever own a home. Rent consumes such a high share of income that saving for a deposit feels impossible. At the same time, wages for young workers have stagnated. In real terms, entry-level salaries today buy less than they did for their parents' generation at the same age. Many young professionals in 2025 earn just enough to cover essentials but struggle to build savings or invest. Without asset, they fall further behind as wealth continues to accumulate in older age groups. This is the heart of Britain's dilemma. Policymakers can keep relying on short-term fixes, stealth taxes that drain household income, benefit cuts that push the poorest into deeper hardship, and policies that drive entrepreneurs and investors abroad. But these fixes erode the base of the economy rather than strengthen it. Each year of delay makes recovery harder because skills are lost, infrastructure decays, and young people choose to leave. The alternative is to invest in the future, in productivity, skills, and infrastructure. Britain's productivity gap with peers is no secret, but that isn't destiny. Investments in transport, digital networks, and affordable housing could unlock growth. Instead of cutting university budgets or freezing training programs, Britain could channel resources into building a workforce ready for the industries of tomorrow: green energy, AI, advanced manufacturing. And then there's the idea Britain's avoided for decades: creating its own sovereign wealth fund. Imagine if, rather than spending every pound of resource revenue or windfall taxes, the UK had saved for the future. A properly managed fund could invest globally, generate steady returns, and protect younger generations from the boom and bust cycles that have defined the British economy. Norway did this with oil. Singapore did it with trade surpluses. Even small Gulf states use their natural resources to prepare for the day when those resources run out. Britain, by contrast, is left exposed. For the average British citizen, the choice may not feel abstract. Either Britain builds a system where work and innovation are rewarded with stability, or it doubles down on policies that punish effort while rewarding speculation. Right now, too many young people feel that studying hard, working full-time and paying taxes doesn't guarantee a decent life. That sense of hopelessness corrodes not just the economy, but democracy itself. If nothing changes, by 2030, Britain will not just be poorer, it risks losing relevance in the global economy. Britain's decline is not inevitable, but it is accelerating. For nearly 2 decades, governments have chosen short-term fixes over long-term solutions. Debt grows, wages stagnate, and the young are left poorer every year. So the question is, will the country be able to save itself before it's too late?